Hello and welcome to the second episode of the Unfiltered Show. My name's Nathan and that is Paul. How are you doing, Paul?
Very well, thank you. How are you, Nathan?
Yeah, great. We're having a chat today all about accessibility. We're going to go really deep, I think, into this topic. We're joined today by Lucy Collins. How are you doing, Lucy?
Very well. Hello. Nice to meet you guys.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. So, before we get into this topic, I guess given the nature of the expertise required to talk with authority about this, we probably should give you a chance to explain your authority. So, Lucy, would you mind spending a moment just telling us who you are, who you work for, what you do, what your background is, and so on?
Sure thing. Hi, I'm Lucy. I'm from a company called Web Usability. We are a research agency, so we're all about finding out what is it that people want from digital services and then how well they work. And that is inclusive of people with disabilities. And accessibility is something that for us as a business, certainly we have grown into and explored further over the last 5 to 10 years. We initially got involved in accessibility about a decade ago during the creation of what I'm sure we'll get into, but the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And in the more recent few years, we have done a lot of research with people that have lived experience of disability to try and understand how we can be working with clients to improve websites, apps, digital services of any description, really, to make sure that not only do they technically work for people that have these disabilities and use various different assistive technologies, but also, can they actually just get to the information that they need? Can they use the forms that they need to be able to fill out so that they are in no way hindered or prevented from engaging with the online world in the same way that people without disabilities are not?
Yeah, I kind of have this intuition that when the internet started, nobody realized that so much of our lives would be given over to the internet. And so
Yep.
now, for example, if I wish to do almost anything connected with the government or banking or anything like that, then I am sent online. If I want to, I don't know, troubleshoot a problem with my internet connection, I'm sent online. And
Yep.
given that that's the norm now, the requirement, well, we'll discover whether it's a requirement or not later, but the requirement, shall we say, to have these forms and parts of the internet, forms, menus, navigation, anything you might care to mention, accessible is increasingly important. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think you touched on a nice point there, Nathan, because it's not, when you talk about digital accessibility, a lot of people think, oh, well, we're talking about disability here. But actually, it's so much broader than that. There's a term universality that gets used a lot around the world of accessibility, which actually is just about making sure that things online can be accessed by as many people as possible, regardless of their physical situation, their physical ability, their digital levels. And so, what you're saying there about people, the norm these days being that we access things, we do things online. That's not the norm for a huge number of people. There are several million people that either don't have access to the online world due to, yeah, perhaps a physical impairment, but also perhaps due to lack of internet connection or lack of ability to afford the technology that's required of them. Or it might just not be the thing that they're into. I think of my 94-year-old granny. She's not going to be doing everything online, although she does have an iPhone that she's fairly adept at. And so it's just about making sure that we're not excluding huge proportions of people by either limiting our ability to do things only online, or if we are doing them online, making sure that that experience is as easy as possible for everyone, regardless of any assistive technology or constraints that they might have.
So, given everything that you've just said, is there like a broad definition of what web or digital accessibility is? Is there one way of sort of encapsulating that whole thing?
Not, I mean, I don't think if you look in the dictionary, there would be. I think it is defined in a number of different ways by a number of different people, depending on what area of digital accessibility you're involved with. As I say, I always like to use this word universality. I like to think of it as being this all-encompassing thing of just making things easy for people to use and access. But I think in the sort of technical and legal world, which I know we'll come on to when we do think about digital accessibility, we are thinking specifically of people that have disabilities and use a variety of assistive technologies, such as screen readers, screen magnifiers, speech recognition software. There's all sorts of things out there on the market that allow people with various different disabilities to engage with the online world, in much the same way that people without disabilities are able to do so. But no, unfortunately, nothing as simple as a single definition, I believe.
No, it very kindly you've put together some show notes which we're sort of cribbing from as we go through this, and you've written down or quoted from the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, and I'll quote. It says, "Web accessibility means that websites, tools, and technologies are designed and developed so that people with disabilities can use them. More specifically, people can perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with the web and contribute to the web." So that's a fairly broad definition there. But then it goes on, or at least you go on to break that down into 4 key principles of web accessibility. I wonder if you wouldn't mind giving us the rundown of what they are and how they work.
Yeah, of course. So it's probably worth sort of backtracking slightly and just saying, well, what is the web content or web accessibility in terms of who are the people that have developed that definition? So the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C Consortium, are a group of sort of invited experts from across not just the digital space. You've got people from academia, you've got people who have lived experience of disability, sort of all coming together to put their heads together and say, well, okay, how can we try and create a set of guidelines against which people can build digital services to ensure that they work for people with disabilities? And their definition there is very much thinking about the kind of technical requirements that websites and apps and digital services need to adhere to in order to make sure that they will work with this plethora of assistive technologies that exist in the world these days. So they've created what they call the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, WCAG. It's got lots of different ways of being pronounced. And that's split into these 4 principles that you refer to there, Nathan. So you've got perceivable, which basically just means that content on your website, people need to be able to see it, to use it, they can understand your content. And so by that, it's not just visually, can I see something, i.e. is color contrast sufficient, but also will my screen reader pick up the fact that I've got various different sections on my page, that I've got various different form elements that I need to fill out. Then we've got operable. So that's all about, well, can I use something so I can see it either visually or my screen reader can see it for me? Can I use it? And that means, can I use it with any of the assistive technologies that might be available? So like me, I imagine you probably navigate the online world using a mouse most of the time. That's not the norm for a lot of people. If I have a physical disability, I might use speech recognition software, I might use a keyboard, I might use a switch key, things like that. So can I navigate a website using those technologies? Can I navigate it using my screen reader? And can I navigate it at high levels of zoom, where perhaps I can only see a very small portion of the page? So that's about operability. Then we've got understandable or understandability, and that's much more thinking about the content that you're producing. Can I read it? Do I understand what it's telling me? Do I know where, if I click on a link, it's going to take me? Is it clear what I've done wrong if an error appears on a form and things like that? And then finally, you've got something called robust, and that's really just making sure that any website will work with a whole range of assistive technologies that exist. And it's one of the more technical guidelines where we're thinking about, well, does the HTML of this website work with this assistive technology? But really, it's just about making sure that regardless of the tool I use, I can access and use your website as easily and simply as possible.
Lucy, can you tell me about the different iterations of WCAG? Because I believe there's been a few versions over the years.
Yes, yeah, you are quite right, Paul. So there have been, I think we're on 3 versions now. So we have 1.0, 2.0, 2.1, and excitingly, we are on the cusp of 2.2, which is due to be released imminently. It's been in the pipeline for a little while now. They're talking about late 2023 at the moment as the date that will be released as the official, to become the official recommended version. But what each iteration has done is, rather than replace or sort of throw out what was before, it just augments the existing guidelines. And this is as our understanding of how people with disabilities engage with the online world, how their behaviors evolve, how assistive technologies develop, and new ones come onto the market. New considerations need to be added so that we're ensuring that we're keeping websites as up to date as possible for all these different requirements that might exist. So I think we're up to sort of somewhere around 70-ish guidelines across the 3 different levels of compliance which exist. So within each WCAG iteration, you've got 3 possible levels of compliance: level A, level AA, and level AAA, quite easily. The level A is obviously the lowest level of compliance, and that's the one that should just be a given. These are things like ensuring that every single item on your website can be accessed with a keyboard. It's about making sure that as much as possible, the relationship between different structures on a website are clearly announced by a screen reader. Then you've got things that are slightly more complex or perhaps slightly more difficult to implement, which will be level AA. And that's going to be things like ensuring that your error message not only exists, but is also actually really nice and descriptive. It describes where the error has occurred and how to resolve it. It's about making sure that, if possible, your color contrasts are more than just, the minimum requirement, that we are hitting a slightly more enhanced level. And then finally, you've got AAA, which is the highest level of compliance. And that's where it might be not only quite difficult to meet that level of compliance, but also it's going to just augment in many ways a lot of the things that we will already have covered off in level AA and level A. So that will be about improving the readability of text, making sure that you've got a reading age that is appropriate for a wide variety of people. It's going to be about bumping up your error messaging to be even more descriptive, or your color contrast to be even higher. So it's taking it that step further.
Do you see companies aiming for particular levels for any particular reason? And are there any legal implications of not meeting a certain level of compliance?
Yeah, so the standard level that people try and achieve is level AA, so WCAG version 2.1, level AA. The reason for that, and that's certainly the case here in the UK, the reason for that is that there is a piece of legislation that came into play in 2018 called the Public Sector Bodies Accessibility Regulations, which stipulates that WCAG 2.1 level AA is the level that public sector organisations specifically need to achieve in order to be considered compliant with this piece of legislation. So not only is it compliance with that, but it's publishing a statement on your website, an accessibility statement on your website that says, this is how we comply, this is where we don't comply, so that we're just being really transparent about how we're doing. It's not necessarily a case that we all need to be, ideally, obviously, it'd be fantastic if we could all say we were compliant with WCAG at this certain level. But actually, if we can also be honest about where we know problems exist, it allows people to kind of circumnavigate those potential problem areas. It allows them to reach out to people where they might need help because a certain form is not accessible, or a certain functionality might not work for them depending on their accessibility requirements. So it's all about encouraging transparency rather than necessarily giving everybody a slap on the wrist because they're not doing things correctly.
And I think that's quite important, isn't it? Because it's we know from a web development perspective or an app development perspective that the range of devices that we need to test on, that we need to build against, is vast, and that changes on a daily basis. And occasionally, you might find that you don't get it right everywhere at the same time. And I think providing those routes for people to be able to come in and go, hey, this isn't working for me, but it's dealt with in a, I'm making you like a responsible disclosure to say this doesn't work, and then the company can go, we will fix that for you. I think that's potentially a much better way forward than instantly going through to legal implications, for instance.
Yeah, I think so. I think this is a world where we're all learning. I don't think anybody has the answers of, what makes something 100% accessible. Also because disability comes in an infinite number of forms, and the idea that you can build for accessibility, you can build for disability, is actually just completely misleading, because it takes away the humanity that every single person with a disability is an individual in their own right. And so if you're saying, oh, well, I've done this, I've ticked this WCAG box, so people who are blind should be able to use my website, and it's like, well, completely undermines the fact that you've got people with all sorts of different varieties of visual impairment that might impact the way that they're using a website. Some people might not see certain colors, some people might not see anything, some people might see a small amount that allows them to navigate in a certain way, but then they require a screen reader to just support or augment that experience. So I think, and I think as a result, we all need to think about, well, how can we work together with people who have a lived experience of disability just to try and improve this experience, rather than, okay, let's do this to tick a compliance box to avoid the unlikely event of legal action as much as possible, because it's just not a very nice way of doing things.
Good intentions, I think, is always the answer. Are we doing this with the best of intentions?
Yeah.
Are we trying our best to deliver? And I think sometimes we need to remember that to do the right thing.
Another section in the show notes that you put together for us, I think this is probably one of the most important parts of the discussion that we're going to have. We're just going to delve for a minute into how do people with disabilities navigate the online world, and what kind of technologies are they using? And the reason I think this is important from my perspective is that I am lucky enough, for want of a better word, I am able to access the internet in a quotes typical way. I have my mouse, I have my keyboard, I have glasses, but my sight is basically fine. I can hear everything okay. So I have this experience of the internet, and more or less everything that's ever been built for the web has been designed in a way that I can access it. But you've mentioned quite a few different things which need to be taken into consideration. So yeah, let's get into that. What are the disabilities and the technologies that people are using to access the web, and how do they differ, and how do we cater for them?
Yeah, of course. So I should probably start by saying that, like yourself, I don't have a disability personally. So I very much see myself as a spokesperson for all of the people that we've had the pleasure of doing research with over the years. The reason I got into accessibility in the first place really was my mum has got a fairly severe physical disability, and I always saw how frustrating it was for her to try and navigate the online world, and it sort of gave me that real motivation to say, well, this is a problem that I feel we can fix. And so by then having the opportunity to speak to people that have a variety of disabilities, observe how they use their assistive technologies to navigate the online world, hopefully I can talk fairly confidently on the topic. But there's sort of, in the digital accessibility world, I guess we kind of think of it in 4 key categories, mainly due to the way that people do use different assistive technologies and consume content online. So firstly, we've got that of physical disabilities, and that can be anything from sort of obviously loss of certain fine motor control skills. It could be as extreme as the loss of a limb. It can include things like seizures, epilepsy, as well as obviously uh, paralysis, anything that's going to impact physically how you perhaps use a mouse, how you perhaps type on a keyboard, and things that you probably take for granted day to day. So the assistive technology that those individuals might use will be simpler keystrokes. So perhaps they don't use a mouse because they lack the fine motor control to be able to accurately move that across the screen and select the touch points. So they might use keyboard strokes instead. They might use the tab key to basically navigate through interactive elements on a page. Alternatively, they might use speech recognition software. This is something that's becoming a lot more common for, I think, a lot of people. I know a lot of people now use sort of Siri on their phone, or the Android version, to sort of dictate messages in WhatsApp or whatever. But it's something that people also use to navigate websites on computers. So the most common in the market is Dragon Naturally Speaking and Windows speech recognition software. And they basically allow you to speak a command, open a window, close a button, select this, select that, type this, and it will basically do it for you. So those are kind of the 2 key ways that those sorts of users might navigate the online world. Then we've got to think of people who are neurodiverse or might have a cognitive disability. So this is a really, really broad category that's a lot to do with how people take in and understand content. And some of the key issues that people might have is inability to focus for long periods of time, difficulty in assimilating complex passages of text, understanding what links and buttons are going to do if they're not clearly and explicitly described. So there's a variety of different tools that people might use here, depending on the neurodiversity, which can include things like obviously dementia, ADHD, autism, as well as mental health conditions that just might, as you say, limit attention spans or ability to focus. So this is one of those categories where it's so broad. And what I was talking about, actually having to think about people as individuals rather than just a category, it's very difficult, because it might be that, okay, they might invert the colors they are on a screen, they might increase the size of it, they might print it out and read it rather than having it in a digital form. They might use a screen reader of some description, a voiceover, because they take in content better if they hear it rather than if they read it. So the list here is almost endless. But what people are very good at doing in this category, I guess, is finding the thing that works for them. And so what we need to do is make sure that we don't put anything that will stop them applying those changes to websites. Then we've got people who are deaf or hard of hearing. And as you say, the obvious thing there is that we need to make sure that any audio content, anything that we're saying, anything that happens on a screen, is also described in text. And the common example of that is subtitles or captions, which is also just becoming commonplace for all videos really these days. Plenty of us like to watch videos on social media without having the sound playing out loud. So it has a much broader impact there, which is nice. And then finally, we've got the visual impairment side of things. And that can be anything from a mild visual impairment, which doesn't actually impact, or require the use of assistive technology, but maybe you need to use a screen magnifier. And some people I've seen will increase the size of their screen from 500 to 600%. So you're seeing a tiny little window, scrolling back and forth, left, right, up and down to try and take in everything that's on the page. And then all the way through to people that have almost or total loss of vision. And then they will be using a screen reader, which is probably the experience most far removed from, I imagine, what you're used to, because as you can imagine, you have to listen to absolutely everything that's going on and somehow form a picture of what a website looks like, how everything fits together from what you're hearing. And it can be the one that can cause often the most problems if websites are not technically built well, because then things will not be announced properly, and it's not going to be easy for blind people to form that picture and get an understanding of how everything fits together and what they can actually do on your website.
We've talked quite a lot about accessibility within websites. Is there a difference in accessibility in mobile apps?
No, so the same principles apply. And it's probably worth noting that WCAG was originally developed specifically for web, as the name suggests, web content accessibility guidelines. And it's one of the challenges of WCAG in many ways, is how do you apply those in different circumstances, such as apps. Another one I've come across is how does it apply to an e-learning platform, for example, which again is very different to a web environment. But the principles still apply. And I think this is why it's important to think of the guidelines as guidelines rather than rules, because what you need to think about is, well, what are the behaviors that I'm trying to create? I'm trying to create an app that works with a screen reader. I'm trying to create an app that can be navigated using an external Bluetooth keyboard or whatever it might be. And so then it's about then applying those guidelines in an app environment. So absolutely, apps are considered, and in fact they are certainly included in the UK public sector legislation. They are explicitly referenced, so there is a legal requirement to make your apps work with WCAG or compliant with WCAG in the same way that your websites will, because those browsing experiences are very similar for the end user, even if they are built in a totally different way by the developers.
And one thing that as a developer, I would find it hard to understand, I guess, how many people are using those kind of features, because there doesn't seem to be an implicit tracking mechanism to be able to do that. So is there a way to understand how many people might be using those kind of features, such as zoom or inverting colors, as you said, or using a screen reader on your website, or it's just no way of knowing, and you kind of have to build with that in mind regardless.
Yeah, I think unfortunately, although I may be wrong here, that there isn't necessarily a way to pick up on that. Your analytics aren't going to show how many people are coming to your site using a screen reader, or at what level are they zooming into, because all of these tools and technologies are happening at the system level. So while you might be able to tell that they're coming to your site from Germany, you won't know that they're then also doing it with a screen reader. And the same way on your phone, again, a lot of those technologies are at the system level. So all phones these days have a built-in screen reader. They've all got a built-in zoom function or a screen magnifier function. They've all got built-in speech recognition software. So you're not, unfortunately, going to be able to pick up on exactly how people are engaging with the site. But it's probably worth mentioning that I think the current stats, although these go out of date so quickly, are that there are something like 14.6 million people in the UK with a registered disability. And a good proportion of those will be using some form of assistive technology to access a site, an app, whatever it might be. And those numbers obviously don't take into consideration people that don't have a registered disability. So people that still might use assistive technology. They might, for example, someone who's slightly more advanced in years. Certainly I know my dad, he's blessed him going blind. So I think he ends up often blowing up the size of screens, but he's not registered blind. He's just getting a bit older. So there's plenty of people. I think that, that number is actually probably very conservative in many ways. And so actually it's a huge proportion of our population that have a potential need. So yes, you might not be able to get the specific numbers of how many people you are, but this is not a small pool of people. This is not a niche that we're having to pander to. This is a really important group of users who are otherwise getting excluded quite significantly from the online world.
Yeah, because that number that you referenced there is probably 20% of the population of the UK, and that
Exactly.
includes children, it includes older people. Like you say, anybody beyond. I mean, Nathan and myself both have glasses, and I struggle when I don't have my glasses on to read something. You get to a certain age, dare I say it, and your vision starts to go, and suddenly you're not able to read everything on your phone without having your glasses on. So that number of people is much higher, as you say, and doesn't always refer to people that have a registered or recognised disability.
It's interesting as well. It's slightly tangential, but I have found myself literally trying to zoom in on a book. And the reason I say that is it's ridiculous, isn't it? But I've become so wedded to consuming everything online that I kind of pinch and try to zoom in the actual physical paper book. And it just made me think, well, the internet really is the method for getting information these days, isn't it? Certainly for somebody like me, a lot of the books, without my glasses, almost all printed material is completely out of scope for me. So I'm always going to be going online to access these things. And I think as time goes on, and I'm guessing my eyesight will deteriorate slowly, it'll be even more the case. So I would imagine that the number, you said somewhere in the region of 14 million people, something like that, I would imagine that number is probably only going to get higher if we were truly to discover what the number of people were. So Paul and I being a case in point, in some way we fit into that spectrum, albeit only for modest sight repair, really. So Lucy's outlined for us there really well some of the accessibility things that people are facing. I guess we should really talk about how you might mitigate these things on your internet properties, be that apps or websites. So what kind of things are we doing to test these apps and websites? What tools can we use? What systems are there?
Yeah, so there's quite a few out there. There's sort of two key categories of accessibility testing. The first is automated testing, of which you guys are no doubt familiar with a host of different tools and that are out there that basically allow us to automatically pick up accessibility issues in relation to WCAG. So these will tend to scan websites primarily. There aren't lots of really good ones out there for apps, is primarily in the web space, that will pick up issues to do with the page structure, to do with color contrast, to do with whether or not images are missing alt text, and it will tends to feed back quite nicely what the issue is, how to resolve them. A couple of good ones on the market include WebAIM's Wave tool. Google and Firefox both had inbuilt ones, Google Lighthouse, and then the Mozilla Firefox accessibility checker. There's another one, another very nice one called Axe, A-X-E by Deek, that is useful and quite good at picking up lots of issues. But automated testing will only get you so far down the testing journey. I think one of the things about WCAG is that there is a subjectivity to their interpretation, which is, again, where we always fall back on either testing with people that have disabilities or certainly getting feedback from these real people, because we're really trying to understand, well, what is the behavior that we're trying to create here? What is the experience that we're trying to improve? So while you might pick up a lot of the structural issues, quite a lot of the technical issues with your automated testing, estimates are that this sort of testing can only identify somewhere in the region roughly of 20 to 40% of accessibility issues. You know, it's a bit variable depending on the tool you're using. If you use lots of them in combination, you're going to be a little bit more comprehensive. But it's probably worth noting that you're probably not getting more than half of the accessibility issues that could exist on a website by using the automated tools. And that's why there's also a really important part or role for manual testing. And by that, we mean actually exploring a website with the assistive technologies that we've talked through already today. So screen readers, screen magnifiers, speech recognition software, using a keyboard to tab through things, as well as then looking at content and making sure that, okay, yeah, it's there, but does it actually serve a purpose? And a classic example of that is alt text or alternative text, which is obviously the text that appears in place of an image. Either if it doesn't load, or obviously if you're using a screen reader, it's key to trying to understand, well, what is that image? And I think historically there's been a sense that every image on a website should have an alt text. That was sort of how people interpreted the guideline when it first came into existence. But the more we test with people who are blind, the more we see the experience of what it's like to use a website with a screen reader, the more actually you're seeing that a lot of that alt text is just adding unnecessary clutter to what is already a very busy experience for these users. So if you've got an image that's just there to make your page look pretty, it doesn't actually add any context. And actually it may do more harm than good, and that it might just get in the way of them getting to the really important content that's actually available on the page. So there is a subjective element that comes into play when looking at images, going, okay, yeah, it's got an alt text, but it just says picture of a tree, which doesn't help anybody. And so actually in that case, it might be better for that to be given what we call an empty alt text or a null alt text, which means it's actually just ignored by a screen reader. Conversely, obviously, if you do have an image that's conveying something important, perhaps it's a hotel website and you've got these lovely pictures of a really chic hotel room, but all it says is a bed in a room, it's not really going to convey actually, well, what's it going to be like for me to sleep in that room? What's it going to be like to be there? So then it's a case of going, okay, well, what is it that this image is trying to convey? It's trying to convey that this is a really plush experience, that you're going to be there, I don't know, surrounded in velvet or whatever hotel room you're going to. So that's where the automated testing falls down. That's where you need the kind of human element. And I'm sure AI will catch up with us at some point, but at this stage, manual testing is still really important to ensure that some of that subjectivity is considered when we're interpreting the guidelines.
Nobody, when they use things in real world, what we found when testing websites with real people is they go on journeys that you don't expect. In your mind, when you're building something, either a web or a website or an app, you kind of have in mind, well, actually, they're going to go to there, and then they're going to go to here, and this is what we've designed from a UX point of view. And then you give it to somebody in real world, and they go, oh, I'm going to start here, and then I'm going to go back over there, and then I'm going to go and do this. And you're like, and actually, I think that manual testing is really, really important because, like you say, it's going to uncover things that you didn't expect or plan for.
Paul, can I ask you a question? Given everything that we're talking about and your experience with your agency, where does this fit into the jigsaw puzzle of how you finally ship a website? Where do you, where does your agency put this in the workflow?
It's a really good point. So we've worked with Lucy and Web Usability on clients in the past, and I think bringing them into the conversation at the start of the process, at the design stage, is really, really important, because the feedback that they can give in terms of, okay, well, your color contrast needs to be X, or actually that's going to cause a problem when you develop it on the page, or you might not to watch out for that kind of animation. That's a good starting point before we go into development. Obviously, then once we've QA'd our work, it would then go to the accessibility consultant or partner to be able to go through that site with the content in place to be able to provide some feedback to us before it ships out finally to the client UAT environment and then into production.
So yeah, that's really interesting. It's like an iterative, ongoing process, and presumably, once you've shipped it to the clients, if it's a CMS and the clients are updating things all the time, maybe the whole process needs to be done time and time again. A little bit like painting the Forth Bridge. You need to revisit a year from now, and then a year after that, and what have you.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more strongly with that. I think accessibility is often seen as I've done that thing by some organizations, and it's just not possible to think about it in that way. It is a constantly moving field. It's constantly evolving. And, as every time you add content to a website or import it into an app, you have the ability to sort of undo a lot of the good accessibility work that might have been done at the development stage. So a really important part of this whole accessibility journey is good training, good governance, so that when content is added, an alt text is considered, or an image is considered in terms of what is the right alt text to go with this. Content is, headings are added in the right way. Because so often you'll see people launch a beautiful website that's totally WCAG compliant, and then within a week, someone's added something and broken it. So no, definitely a Forth Road Bridge kind of situation we've got here.
When we build websites in WordPress nowadays, actually what we have now is more controls. There's a big argument about accessibility in WordPress, and we can never really do enough. And I think that's well known. But when you're building a website now, because everything is block based, we can theme blocks so that we can put limits on what people can do with those blocks. So that helps by meaning that the design is consistent, or the options that somebody putting content into a block are consistent, where they've got a set way of doing things. And we can also build patterns with blocks, which means that we're almost providing them with pre-built patterns that work right out of the box. So whilst we're not solving all of the issues, we are minimizing what could potentially go wrong.
Again, Paul, another question for you, if you don't mind. How much persuading do you need to do with your clients regarding accessibility? I'm just wondering if there's a proportion of your clients, and we won't mention names, but if there's a proportion of your clients who see this as more important, crucial, we simply refuse to ship the website until we've tackled all of this. I'm sure there's some of those, but equally, I'm sure there are other people who would prefer this work to take a lower priority. I'm just wondering how that conversation goes, and that might well lead into some of the legal arguments and things that we will get onto in a minute.
I think you're right. I think there's always a balance between how important some people might view it compared to others, and that depends perhaps where they are in their journey into digital, and it may depend on what sector that they work in. We have a default position, which is that every site that we build will have a minimum of AA accessibility. That's in our statement of work, and we put it up front so that we kind of have it there, so we don't need to have that conversation, really. We say, okay, we're going to do this, and then we will bring in a partner to test our work if we need to do that, so that we're not checking our own homework, really, because that's the worst place to be in. I think the real tension tends to come with creative, because I think that there's the creatives can sometimes, perhaps unnecessarily, feel that they might be constrained by some of the accessibility guidelines to be completely free to do whatever they want. And I think so that tension comes in where you're trying to explain, well, actually, we can't put those two colors together, even though creatively you might think that's a really good idea, because this is the impact that it's going to have. I think that's where it helps to have a third-party partner like Lucy and her team to be able to provide those expert opinions in a more objective viewpoint. And actually, that helps the process, because it's not us talking to a client; it's us bringing in a third party with their expert knowledge and going, okay, well, let's hear from them to perhaps show us the way on those kind of issues.
So we know that there are legal requirements in terms of accessibility. You mentioned, Lucy, all about WCAG and the stipulations there within. But I'm wondering if that's a bit of a sliding scale. Will the lawyers be coming after you if you don't have 100%, let's say AA 2.1 or 2.2 in the near future compliance? Where do we sit in terms of our responsibility, not from a moral point of view, but more from a legal point of view?
Yeah, of course. No, it's an important question in the world of accessibility. It's one that unfortunately we can't get away from. So I think it's probably worth saying, firstly, WCAG itself isn't a kind of legally enforced thing. W3C are not a legal body, but what has happened with WCAG is that it has been baked into legislation all around the world as the kind of gold standard, the best practice of which we can sort of codify accessibility against. I think the challenges with accessibility from a legal point of view is that not all legislation is made equal, in that depending on where you are, depending on the type of organization you are, the type of sector you work in, there are different requirements that you need to consider. So the three key areas, I guess, that we tend to talk about is the UK, the US, and the EU, Europe. Within the UK, you've obviously got the Equalities Act 2010 that talks about making reasonable adjustments to ensure that spaces, both physical and online, although it isn't actually, as far as I'm aware, sort of explicitly written in that way, are accessible. But the understanding in the industry is that that the Equalities Act applies to digital spaces in the same way it does to physical spaces. So, for example, a restaurant needs to offer a ramp or some sort of alternative for someone in a wheelchair to get into their building, in the same way that the website for that restaurant ought to offer a similarly accessible experience for people with a variety of disabilities. But nowhere in the Equalities Act is it codified exactly how you become accessible in a digital space. So that's where WCAG comes into things, because as already touched on, we have the Public Sector Accessibilities Regulation, which came in 2018, which does specify that WCAG 2.1 level AA and an accessibility statement published on your website is the standard that we need to achieve in order to be compliant. So having almost set the benchmark there, the expectation in the UK is that by following what the public sector are doing, very much they're leading the way in this space, that all organisations will be sort of meeting that accessibility obligation under the Equalities Act 2010 as well. It's, as far as I'm aware, although I might not be totally up to date on this, not fully been tested in a court of law in the UK yet, although there have been a number of cases settled out of court. The US, on the other hand, is obviously a totally different kettle of fish. Given the sort of culture that exists there, there has been a lot more in the way of challenges in the kind of legal world when it comes to accessibility. Similar to here in the UK, there's sort of two pieces of legislation to consider. The first is the ADA, the American Disabilities Act, as well as the revised Section 508. So the ADA obviously applies to all organizations, whereas revised Section 508 is again specific to federal or public organizations. Similar to here in the UK, the public sector legislation is a little bit more clear in terms of actually how you comply. This time they specify WCAG 2.0, or a variation of WCAG 2.0, is the kind of is what underpins that legislation. The ADA side of things again is a little bit more amorphous, a little bit more vague, and it's also being tested a lot more at the moment. I know, Nathan, you were saying actually you spoke to another colleague in the accessibility world who was talking about some of the cases that have come up. I think the ambulance chasing that you were talking about. I don't know if you wanted to share some of that.
Yeah, it would appear to be the case that this is now. I don't know how to describe this really, but ambulance chasing seems to be the right phrase. That there is a possibility, if you have a presence on the web, that people are going to be looking quite deliberately to see if you have complied with the bare minimum. Let's say that. And then if you haven't, then that presents an opportunity for them to take you to court and potentially sue you. So in a shame though it is, it would appear that there's an industry of lawyers who are looking at this as a way to generate revenue. Now, it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? Because on the one hand, the argument could be made that, well, that's all for the good because these lawyers are going out and they're, in a sense, they're getting people to do the work that they should be doing. On the other hand, it creates a real difficulty for people who may not, they may be entirely genuine about their enterprise to get up to speed with this, but they just haven't quite got there yet. So it's difficult. I don't quite know what the answer is, but that adversarial nature of it seems to be certainly more prominent across the pond in North America than it is here at the moment.
I think it unfortunately creates this slight environment of fear around accessibility, and it once again means we lose sight of why we're doing this in the first place, which
Right.
is all about the experience of individual people. And when it boils down to, oh well, I'm going to get done because I'm not compliant, you forget that and you start to tick the box of accessibility compliance. And as we know, while you might be WCAG compliant, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're also offering the best possible experience for these individuals. And so people get so focused on hitting compliance that we sort of forget the bigger picture of why it is that we're trying to do this. So yes, I agree, it is pushing the accessibility agenda, this sort of behavior, but not in a particularly transparent or inclusive way. In many ways, I think also because a lot of the legislation doesn't stipulate or exactly set out how to comply, there's always going to be opportunities for people, if they are that way inclined, to get you, because it's a constantly changing world. New technologies are constantly on the market, so it sort of will be the gift that keeps on giving for these sorts of lawyers, because there isn't necessarily a very clear cut, you've done this, because again we're trying to design for millions and millions of individual human beings. So I think it's a really challenging time, but interesting.
Yeah, I think the incentives, it's a difficult one to square perfectly, isn't it? In that if it's carrot and stick, isn't it? You would like the carrot to be the incentive, but it would appear certainly in certain parts of the world that the stick is more the incentive. And I guess that's just what we're dealing with. Can I just ask a question? Oh, sorry, Paul.
So I was just going to say it's slightly analogous to the GDPR arguments, isn't it? Where the internet for a long time, or the World Wide Web, has been fairly unregulated, and I think the regulation starts to come in, as it does with any industry, once it scales, and it's important to have that regulation there. But I feel that the internet or the web is such a fast moving feast that actually the regulation can't quite keep up. We're going to be in a similar position with AI very shortly, and it very much is that carrot and stick approach, and carrot gets tried for a bit and then you have to bring the stick in, but ultimately the stick can be a bit too tough at times, until perhaps a middle ground can be reached.
Yeah. Lucy, staying with the legal side of things, I have a question around. Well, you mentioned that there are three jurisdictions which you were wishing to talk about today. So there was the US, the EU, and the UK. Given that the internet is, well, by its very nature, any website is available anywhere. That's part of the beauty of it. How do we work with websites, for example, that were built in the UK, so they were built under UK law, but they're selling, let's say, WooCommerce or something like that. They've got products which they're selling and shipping out, or even maybe they're, I don't know, maybe they've even got offices or something in the United States. Is there a fine line? Is there some clear blue sky between one thing and the other, or is there more of a grey area? Sometimes you're UK, sometimes you're US.
Yeah. I mean, I should probably state at this point that I'm not a lawyer. This is very much just my interpretation of the law as it currently stands. But no, I think it's quite grey. My understanding of things is certainly that if you deliver a service, regardless of where it's built, if it's delivered in the US, if it's delivered in the UK, it needs to comply with the rules and legislation that apply in that area. In a way, the nice thing is that there is some consistency across the different legislation. So, as I say, WCAG has been embedded as the gold standard across all of these different areas. So we've touched on the UK, the US, and it's the same in the EU. Again, you've got the European Accessibility Act, which, similar to the Equalities Act and the ADA, is sort of quite general in reducing discrimination against people with disabilities. And actually it's much broader than that as well. And then you've also got the Web Accessibility Directive, which, similar to the public sector accessibility regulations in the UK, in fact, the two are identical pretty much. It stipulates WCAG as the standard in which we need to meet. So I think there's the nice thing is if you are building a site or an app to be WCAG compliant, you will be more or less covering yourselves across all of these different parts of the world. But there are nuances in terms of the information that you need to provide, exactly the sort of the admin stuff that needs to go on in the background that will need to happen to ensure that you are fully going to be meeting those various different bits of the world. But yeah, this is certainly where I would be getting the lawyers involved.
Yeah. We talked a little bit earlier about the kind of tools that you might use, but I'm kind of curious to think about the people behind those tools, because obviously, if we are going to be testing this effectively, we've presumably got to be asking real world people to use these real world tools. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, we kind of touched on automated testing, manual testing, and that could be manual testing that you yourselves undertake. So you might download a screen reader, you might have a go with the speech recognition software, but as you quite rightly say, Nathan, the experience of you using it is going to be very different to someone who relies on these tools and technologies on a day-to-day basis to navigate the online world. So I could not advocate more strongly that the best way, and it should be, in my opinion, sort of mandatory in all accessibility testing, is to involve people who have lived experience of disability, people who have disabilities in the work that you do. The reason being that not only will you then be able to see a real expert at work, these are people that have relied on screen readers, speech recognition software, screen magnifiers for many, many years. You'll also be able to get that real world experience of, okay, well, yeah, so technically this website's working with a screen reader, but actually, because of the placement of certain elements, it's almost making it really difficult to understand, in the same way that any usability testing, any UX testing, and Paul, you alluded to this earlier, it can be very eye-opening. You can have that moment where you feel the pain of the user because you can see that they cannot complete a form, they cannot find the crucial piece of information that they need in order to complete their checkout or decide that you're the right organization to work with, or even complete something that's mandatory, like ordering a new bin on their council website or something like that. And so that's why, as much as possible, we always try and encourage our clients to involve people that have disabilities in the testing. We've got a fantastic panel of associates that we work with who are very generous with their time and are very much want to help people understand things from the point of view of someone who has a disability, because they know that it's not the norm for a lot of people. And the only way that you can truly understand what it's like for these individuals is to observe them trying to use your website, trying to complete a task online, because you will then see not only the frustrations that they have, but also actually the incredible abilities that they do have to navigate the site. I mean, for example, we work with a wonderful guy who's been blind since the age of 8. He uses JAWS screen reader. He can navigate a website 3 times quicker than I can, because he listens to it at sort of 5 times speed. So he can hear stuff and assimilate content much quicker than I can read it. So I think it's about not just seeing it as a hindrance. It's not just something that, oh, we've got to do this to tick this box, but actually it's about understanding that your norm is not everybody's norm. And by watching the testers, by seeing real people explore your website, you will see actually that, maybe it's worth you learning how to use a screen reader, because you'd probably save an awful lot of time once you get up the learning curve.
I think it's really interesting because it shows not to mark your own homework. It's a really good reason for not to mark your own homework. If I tried to pretend that I had a disability with my vision, or I had to use a screen reader, I probably wouldn't even know where to start. I wouldn't do it the same way as somebody who has a real disability would do that. And so my results aren't going to be accurate. It would be based upon my presupposed understanding of what it would be like for that person with a disability, rather than getting a real person with a disability do it for us. So I think it's really important to encourage that use of real world testing with real world users.
I think if I could add one thing as well, we've already talked about how WCAG is subjective. They are guidelines, not rules. And I think there can often be a concern that, oh, I'm not applying these correctly, particularly if you're trying to apply them in a non-website environment like an app or an e-learning like we were talking about. And so actually, where there is that disagreement or perhaps a slight concern that you're not applying it in the right way, take it back to the user. Say, okay, I've done this. Does this work for you? And then you're actually getting evidence to support the design decision that you've made, because you've proved that it works with a group of individuals that have this lived experience. So it's a really powerful evidence-based way to kind of make design decisions, make development decisions if there is disagreement within an organization.
So we are big fans of the CMS, the content management system, WordPress. Certainly in my case, and I know in the case of Filter, use it all the time. How does it shape up in terms of accessibility? Broadly speaking, is WordPress considered accessible?
I think you need to look at it 2 different ways, because it's not just one thing. So I think there is WordPress, the CMS, and you might think of that as the admin for how you manage content. And there's a question about accessibility for that. But then there's also the website that you build with WordPress, and that is a separate question. And I think you need to look at those 2 things distinctly. So for the admin itself, there's a great deal of work done by the accessibility teams within WordPress, and that's a voluntary team that works to ensure that the admin is accessible and the content that is produced out of the box is also accessible. And with the introduction of the block editor into WordPress over the past couple of years, that's been quite difficult in some ways to modify what was previously there and ensure it is 100% accessible. But the team have been working really hard to deliver that. So that really helps people with disabilities to be able to use WordPress. And I think there's probably a bit more work to be done, but they're making great strides forwards.
So given all of that about the WordPress admin UI and the way that we actually modify our sites from the back end, what about the front end? What about the actual websites and WordPress?
Yeah, so that's going to be different depending on who develops it and what you're trying to develop. So if you're using things that come out of the box, obviously there's a strong possibility of those being accessible. But if you're writing your own theme, if you're developing your own blocks, if you're adding custom functionality to that website, then you're in a greenfield area where you do need to test for accessibility, and you can't guarantee that everything is accessible at that point. There are plugins that allow you to, or to help you to find that out from a very high level point of view. So a really good example of that is the plugin provided by Equalize Digital. And they are also an agency based in the US, and they've created their own plugin which runs through a number of automated testing scenarios, like we talked about earlier, to tell you about things like contrast and structure of your website, and to check all the basics for you. And I know that they've also done some work with NASA recently to extend that plugin to ensure additional accessibility levels within that. But again, there's a limit to where you can go to with accessibility tools, and there's a wide range of accessibility areas that you need to look at, which is why it's helpful to use a company like Web Usability to do the manual testing, to come at it with a different viewpoint, and to have a conversation with them about how you're meeting those guidelines.
We have this great phrase in the WordPress community, and it basically is that WordPress is enabling the democratization of publishing. And what that really means is it's lowering the barrier to entry so that more or less anybody can publish their own content. Given that WordPress's user base goes from the enterprise right to, I don't know, just some user who wants to put up some information about a hobby that they've got, I wonder where all of this fits into that. In other words, is there anybody who is using WordPress thinking about accessibility? Does anybody get a free pass and gets to say, well, I simply cannot do this because it's a hobby. It's purely a hobby website. I have no intention of giant swathes of the world seeing it. It's just really for me and, I don't know, the local club that I run, and that's all it's useful for. And I know them all, and so on. So I don't know where we sit on that. In other words, is there a spectrum at which point accessibility becomes a must, and anybody sitting on one side of that spectrum probably doesn't need to concern themselves, or is accessibility a requirement? And I choose that word carefully, requirement for everybody, no matter how small your WordPress enterprise might be?
I think that the way I look at it is when you're doing DIY around the house, and there are some people that will just bodge it. I'm probably the prime example of that. That'll be good enough. But I know other people that will make a really big effort to make sure it is right, even if it's not seen by anybody. And, I've asked questions in the past, do you need to go to those lengths? And it's like, well, actually, I'm not building it for now. I'm building it for the future. And if somebody comes along in the future, I want to make sure that it's right for them, as well as this moment in time right now. And I think that if you're building something just as a hobby, you don't know what's going to change tomorrow. If you have a hobby club, for instance, you might have somebody that comes to your club that has a disability. So plan for that in advance, so you don't need to go back and retrofill at a later point in time.
Nice.
That's my view.
Yeah, thank you. Lucy, any intuitions on that?
I agree wholeheartedly with Paul. I think, particularly as you were saying, if you are building an off-the-shelf website, mostly, although there's still some work to be done, most of the kind of default components will be accessible sort of just out the box. So you'd have to work quite hard to then undo some of that good work to reduce the accessibility of things. I think also there just needs to be a shift in our mindset when it comes to developing digital services, that accessibility isn't this thing that we have to add on. It should just be baked into the way that we develop digital services, in the same way that mobile first design has become. And so if we don't think of it as this separate thing that we have to consider, we just think of it as the basic building block of a digital presence, then it won't become this thing that feels like it's hard work, like it's an onus on us as an individual. It will just be the norm. and then everyone will be able to access everything, and it will be a lovely world that we live in.
Brilliant episode. Thank you for joining us today, Lucy. I'm sure that anybody who has watched this, listened to this, or maybe even read it, because it will have captions and transcripts associated with it, hopefully they've learned a great deal. However, the missing piece of this puzzle is all about what you do and what your company does, because I'm imagining that there'll be people with questions. They may, in fact, wish to find out more about the services you provide. So, Lucy, really, over to you. Just tell us a bit about the work that you undertake in this area.
Of course. Well, thank you, Nathan, and also thank you, Paul, for having me here on Unfiltered. So yes, we are based down in the southwest of the UK, just outside Bath, and like all good modern businesses, have a nice, accessible, hopefully, website, just available, webusability.co.uk. So you can find us there. You can find all my details that you need, as well as obviously looking me up on LinkedIn, should you be that way inclined. In terms of the way that we can help, obviously, if you've got any questions about what it is that your users want from your website or your digital service, and then how effectively that is working at any stage of the development process, be it right at the start, or if you have a legacy site that you suddenly realize could probably do with a bit of a refresh, then we can help you understand what it is that people want, how well it's working, and obviously how inclusive, how accessible it is, by getting our fantastic panel of associates to take a look at your site and hopefully give you some constructive and positive feedback to improve really how well it works for everyone.
Well, Lucy, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate that. Just before we sign off, I know that Lucy, in collaboration with the Filter Agency, has been working on, let me get the name right, the Marketeer's Guide to Web Accessibility. So, Paul, possibly Lucy, I don't know if you want to just tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So here at Filter, we're putting together a series of enterprise guides for marketeers, and accessibility was one of the first ones that we did, and that was co-authored with Web Usability. Significant input from Lucy on that. You can find that at our website at filter.agency. It's in our resources section, and you can download that and the other guides that we're doing as well.
Okay, thank you so much. Once more, Lucy, thank you for joining us on the Unfiltered show today. Really appreciate it. I have been Nathan.
And I have been Paul.
See you next time.